As twilight settled over Chicago's suburbs, painting the red brick houses with an orange glow, Margaret Collins was returning from work. The cold December wind caressed her cheeks and rustled the hem of her long coat. As she left the glass doors of the accounting firm, her colleagues called out, "Have a good weekend." She smiled and waved back. At the office, she was a respected senior accountant, admired by her colleagues. But at her parents' home, where she was heading, she would become almost invisible. Climbing into her stylish sedan, Margaret sighed. Ever since the text invitation to Sunday family dinner arrived, she hadn't been able to shake her melancholy mood. "Here we go again," she muttered. Richard and Eleanor's evening of Vanessa worship. Margaret referred to her parents by their first names in her mind. After years of receiving cold stares since childhood, she had learned to create psychological distance. Meanwhile, her sister Vanessa was always called our treasure. As she entered the quiet residential area of North Terrace, lined with impressive homes, the most striking white two-story house came into view. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. Vanessa's brand-new Mercedes was already parked in the driveway. Of course she's here first, Margaret thought. She took a deep breath before pressing the doorbell, preparing herself mentally. Eleanor opened the door, with her perfectly set hair and understated but expensive jewelry. A former nurse, she was now known for her local charity work. "Oh, Margaret. You came," Eleanor's voice lacked enthusiasm. Her tone was like greeting a neighbor or distant relative. "Good evening."
Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I do it too, link below if you're curious.
Margaret tried to maintain her smile. Lively laughter echoed from the living room, Richard's deep chuckle mingling with Vanessa's vibrant voice. Vanessa just shared wonderful news. Eleanor led the way to the living room without touching her daughter's arm. Her promotion to partner at the law firm has been officially confirmed. "That's wonderful," Margaret tried to infuse genuine congratulations into her words. Just last week, she had been promoted to department manager at her accounting firm. But her mother's only response to the email announcement had been a brief, "Congratulations." Entering the living room, Richard stood up. Even after retiring from his banking career, he maintained a businessman's posture, full of dignity. "Ah, Margaret," he said, but his eyes quickly returned to Vanessa sitting beside him. "Did you hear about Vanessa's promotion? This girl is our pride and joy." Vanessa rose gracefully from the sofa and gave her sister a light hug. She wore a designer dress and looked youthful. "Thanks for coming," she said, though her eyes evaluated Margaret's simple pantsuit from top to bottom. "Congratulations, Vanessa," Margaret said sincerely. The sisters' relationship was complicated. As a child, Margaret had grown up protecting Vanessa, but as teenagers, Vanessa gradually began looking down on her. Dinner in the dining room proceeded as usual. Topics centered on Vanessa's promotion, her lavish wedding plans with fiancé Thomas, and the major litigation cases she was handling. Richard and Eleanor listened with sparkling eyes, asking questions and laughing. "Margaret, how about you?" Eleanor suddenly asked. Margaret was surprised by this rare interest directed her way. "Actually, I was promoted to department manager last week," Margaret said with a touch of hope in her voice. "Oh, really?" Eleanor said flatly. "That's nice." Richard remarked, "Well, accounting jobs are stable," then immediately turned to Vanessa. "By the way, about Vanessa's wedding, I've reserved the Grand Hotel ballroom. Only the best for our family princess." Margaret continued eating quietly. The topic of her promotion ended right there. The same thing had happened many times before, when she graduated top of her high school class, when she earned honors in college, when she secured her first major client. Her successes were always dismissed with, "Well, that's nice," before conversation quickly shifted back to Vanessa. "I can help with your wedding preparations," Margaret offered. "I recently helped with a friend's wedding, so I have some experience." "Oh, Margaret," Vanessa smiled slightly. Thank you. But we've hired the best wedding planner, so we're fine. Besides. She paused as if choosing her words carefully. You're still spending your time as, well, an ordinary accountant. Planning a glamorous wedding isn't really your domain. Vanessa, Eleanor lightly scolded, but her eyes were smiling. Margaret maintained her smile while feeling deeply hurt inside. She should be used to her family's words by now, but each time added a fresh wound. By the time dessert was served, Margaret was quietly planning her escape route. I should be going now. I have work early tomorrow, she said. Already? Richard said disapprovingly. We were just about to hear about Vanessa's honeymoon plans. I'm sorry, we'll catch up next time. Margaret stood up. Vanessa, congratulations again. Only Eleanor came to see her off at the entrance. Margaret, she said as she handed her daughter her coat. You should take better care of yourself. You're a good girl, but you should. She paused as if searching for words. You should enjoy life more. Like Vanessa. Margaret inwardly smiled bitterly at her mother's words. It wasn't that she wasn't trying. It was just that her successes and joys were either ignored or minimized in this house. Back in her car, Margaret gazed at her parents' house illuminated by streetlights. Deep inside, questions always swirled. Why was she alone, so alienated? What was different about her? 2 days before the wedding, Margaret stood at the entrance of an elegant country club. The venue for Vanessa's rehearsal dinner was appropriately dignified for the Collins family, Princess. The stone building surrounded by trees exuded a majestic atmosphere in the evening light. Margaret took a deep breath before opening the door. She had chosen a simple but elegant navy dress and styled her hair more carefully than usual. Today, at least, she wanted to appear presentable as one of the guests celebrating her sister's special day. Entering the hall, dozens of guests had already gathered. The sound of sophisticated conversation and laughter filled the air as they held champagne glasses. Margaret looked for her parents. Richard and Eleanor were chatting with Thomas's parents. Margaret, glad you could make it, Eleanor acknowledged her daughter, though her eyes were already looking over Margaret's shoulder, anticipating the next arrival. Sorry I'm late. Work ran long, Margaret apologized. It's fine, Eleanor said lightly. Vanessa hasn't arrived yet. She and Thomas were having a special couples treatment at the spa. After some small talk, Margaret headed to the bar. As she received a wine glass, she heard a voice behind her. Are you Margaret? Turning around, she saw 3 women in elegant dresses. She immediately recognized them as Vanessa's friends. Their faces showed curiosity rather than friendliness. Yes, good evening, Margaret smiled. We're Vanessa's friends from college, one woman said. I can't believe you're her sister. Vanessa always acted like an only child. Margaret's smile froze. We didn't spend much time together. Vanessa was always so talented and charismatic, another woman said. From what I've heard about you, you're. She hesitated for a moment as if choosing her words. More of the plain type. Margaret didn't know how to respond. Fortunately, at that moment applause erupted, and all eyes turned to the entrance. Vanessa and Thomas had arrived. Vanessa wore a pure white cocktail dress and literally glowed. She placed her hand on Thomas's arm and smiled at the guests like a movie star. Richard proudly rushed to his daughter with open arms. Our family treasure has arrived, he announced loudly, drawing warm laughter from the crowd. As the night wore on, Margaret spent most of her time in a corner of the room. All the toasts, touching speeches, and reminiscences revolved around Vanessa. Her parents talked about Vanessa and Thomas's future plans, their new home, and their hope to hold grandchildren soon. Margaret quietly observed, smiled, and applauded at appropriate times. Her presence was like a shadow caught in a family photograph. On the wedding day morning, Margaret woke up early and headed to the venue. Though she hadn't been chosen as a bridesmaid, she hoped to help with something at least. Arriving at the luxurious church, the bridal preparation room was already buzzing with activity. Vanessa sat in a chair, surrounded by busy professional hairstylists and makeup artists. Eleanor and Vanessa's close friends were chatting animatedly while drinking champagne. "Good morning," Margaret called out, and a momentary silence fell. "Margaret, you're early," Eleanor said. "But everything's fine," proceeding smoothly. "Is there anything I can help with?" Margaret asked. "Thank you, but that's not necessary," Vanessa answered through the mirror. "The planner has arranged everything." Margaret just smiled and stood in a corner of the room. The conversation returned to the topic before her arrival, and her presence seemed quickly forgotten. Before the ceremony, family photos began. As Margaret approached, the photographer waved her away. "Excuse me, this is for family only." "I'm her sister," Margaret said quietly. "Oh, Margaret," Eleanor interrupted. "Right now we're just taking photos of the bride's parents and groom's parents." "You can." She thought for a moment. "Take individual photos later." But later never came. The photo sessions continued one after another, and Margaret was never called. Bride with parents, bride with attendants, both families. All combinations were photographed, but Margaret didn't appear in a single one. The ceremony proceeded solemnly. Margaret sat at the edge of the relatives section, watching her sister begin a new chapter in life. Her emotions were mixed, happiness for her sister and pain at not being recognized as a member of this family. The reception was held in a luxury hotel ballroom. Margaret looked for her name on the seating chart. She wasn't at the main family table but assigned to a distant table with distant relatives and company colleagues. As the night progressed, champagne and wine flowed, and the atmosphere grew merrier. The dance floor was crowded, and Richard had finished several whiskeys. His cheeks were flushed, and his walk slightly unsteady. At the buffet table where Margaret had stopped for a light snack, Richard approached her. "Margaret," his voice was louder than usual, causing people nearby to turn around. "Still alone today? When are you going to bring a boyfriend? Look at Vanessa. She's perfect." "Today is Vanessa's day, Dad," Margaret answered quietly. "Don't worry about me." "Not worry." Richard's voice grew louder. "You've been a disappointment since the day you were born. Embarrassing compared to Vanessa." A hush fell over the surrounding area. Margaret stood frozen. Eleanor grabbed her husband's arm, trying to restrain him, but Richard continued. "This girl is our pride. You've always been." "Richard, stop," Eleanor interrupted her husband. But the agreement in her eyes hurt Margaret even more deeply. An awkward silence enveloped the venue. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but she desperately tried not to show them. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Richard," Eleanor called her husband's name, but there was no intention of opposition in her voice. Vanessa laughed to break the tension. She winked at her new husband. She never could read the room. Margaret slowly placed her napkin down. "I'll excuse myself," she said quietly. No one tried to stop her. Margaret left the venue with dignity intact. Once through the hotel's revolving doors, the cool night air caressed her cheeks. Tears began to flow. On the way home, a question emerged in her mind more clearly than ever before: why am I so different from everyone else? Back in her apartment, Margaret pulled out an old family album. She studied photographs of herself as a small child, her parents, and Vanessa. There was a strange pattern. Her parents and Vanessa shared the same features, the same nose shape, same eye color, same curve of smile. But Margaret alone was different. She didn't resemble anyone in the family. Could it be? A terrible suspicion grew in her heart. A week later, Margaret's cell phone rang. Eleanor's name appeared on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Margaret, Eleanor's voice was calm as usual. Come to the family dinner this Sunday. Vanessa and Thomas are returning from their honeymoon. Margaret caught her breath. After what happened at the wedding, she had received no apology from her parents. Not a single word about Richard's drunken outburst. As if nothing had happened. All right, she answered simply. She couldn't find the courage or reason to refuse. On Sunday, Margaret again stood at the Collins family doorstep. She blamed herself. Why had she come again? But deep in her heart was a small hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe Richard would apologize. Richard opened the door. He merely nodded slightly at his daughter. You're late, he said, and walked past Margaret toward the living room. Vanessa and Thomas were already seated in the living room. Their tanned faces told of a tropical beach honeymoon. Vanessa waved at Margaret. So you came, her voice carried a slight tone of victory. Dinner proceeded as expected. Detailed stories of the honeymoon, plans for married life, and Thomas's career at his law firm. Eleanor and Richard asked eager questions and expressed admiration at Vanessa and Thomas's stories. Margaret quietly continued eating, nodding at appropriate times. By the way, Thomas, Margaret tried to join the conversation. Does your law firm specialize in corporate law? I'm interested because my company sometimes needs legal consultation. Suddenly, the table atmosphere changed. Richard put down his fork and stared at Margaret. That's none of your business, his voice was low and dangerous. Thomas's firm deals with major corporations. They wouldn't bother with your small accounting work. Margaret looked at her father in surprise. I was just asking. Enough, Richard's voice grew louder. You always interrupt. This is Vanessa and Thomas's dinner. We didn't come to talk about your job. Eleanor placed her hand on her husband's arm but made no effort to stop him. Vanessa raised her glass and smiled. Dad, it's okay. Don't mind Margaret. I do mind, Richard stood up, placing both hands on the table. Did you come here to do something worthless? You useless girl, don't come back until you've accomplished something of value. The room fell silent. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but she desperately tried to hide them. Thomas uncomfortably shifted in his chair. Richard, Eleanor called her husband's name, but there was no intention of opposition in her voice. Vanessa tried to break the tension with laughter. She winked at her new husband. She never could read the room. Margaret slowly placed her napkin down. Please excuse me, she said quietly. No one tried to stop her. Margaret took her coat and left the house. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She got into her car and started the engine. The lights of her childhood home grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. Back in her apartment, Margaret headed straight for the bathroom. She placed both hands on the sink and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She had been seeking this family's love for so long. Why couldn't they love her? She studied the face in the mirror carefully. Brown hair, greenish eyes, high cheekbones. None of Richard's deep blue eyes, Eleanor's thin nose, or Vanessa's distinctive jawline. I don't look like anyone in this family, she said aloud. The words echoed in her own ears. Something collapsed within her. The sense of alienation she'd felt for years, the lack of belonging, and the strange distance from her parents. Everything pointed to one possibility. Margaret returned to the living room and opened her laptop. She typed DNA test kit in the Google search bar. After a few seconds of hesitation, she pressed the search button. The screen displayed various DNA testing kit advertisements. Discover your roots, confirm family connections, know your genetic background. Margaret clicked on the highest-rated kit and pressed the order button. This will give me answers, she told herself. Answers to all my questions. 3 days later, a small box was delivered to her apartment. As soon as Margaret returned from work, she opened the box and carefully read the instructions. The procedure was simple. Collect a saliva sample, place it in the provided tube, and return it in the enclosed envelope. She followed the instructions and collected the sample. As she placed the tube in the envelope, her hands trembled. Once mailed, there was no turning back. The truth would be revealed. Did she really want that? After a moment's hesitation, Margaret made her decision. She put on her coat and walked to the nearest mailbox. Before sliding the envelope into the slot, she took a deep breath. It's time to know the truth. 2 weeks later, a notification arrived in Margaret's email. Your DNA test results are ready. She sat in front of her computer and logged into her account. Her heart was racing. The results page loaded, and large text appeared on the screen. Family relationships, none found. Margaret sank deep into her chair. The words on the screen blurred before her eyes. No family relationship. No blood connection to the Collins family. Richard, Eleanor, even Vanessa, none of them were her real family. With trembling hands, she scrolled down to see more detailed information. Margaret had no DNA markers matching her designated family members. There was no trace of her in the Collins family gene pool. Who am I? She whispered to the empty room. I have no connection to this family. The truth was shocking but also brought a strange sense of relief. There was a reason for the alienation she had felt for years. She wasn't unloved because of something wrong with her, but because a deeper secret existed. Margaret stood by the window and looked up at the night sky. Her life was now heading in an entirely new direction. She was about to embark on a new journey in search of a truth she had never known. She paced back and forth in her small apartment living room, clutching the printed DNA test results with trembling hands. The morning sun streamed through the curtain gaps, creating long strips of light on the floor. She hadn't slept all night. Where do I even begin? Margaret asked herself. She opened her filing cabinet and pulled out a folder containing personal documents, birth certificate, passport, old school records. Margaret carefully examined her birth certificate. Date of birth, place of birth, parents' names, Richard and Eleanor Collins. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But looking closer, she noticed several suspicious points. The certificate's issue date was 3 months after her birth date. Furthermore, Chicago General Hospital was listed as the birthplace, but Margaret had been told by her mother that she was born at North Terrace Community Hospital. This doesn't make sense, she murmured. Margaret opened her laptop and accessed the Chicago Public Library's digital archive. She began searching for newspaper articles from her birth year, 1986, in the Chicago area. Time passed, and her morning coffee grew cold. Margaret's eyes were tired, but she continued searching. Suddenly, her fingers stopped. The screen displayed a Chicago Tribune article dated March 15, 1986. No progress in Collins' baby kidnapping case. Margaret's heart pounded fiercely. March 15, her birthday. As she read the article, she felt her body growing cold. The 3-day-old daughter of James and Catherine Collins was taken from North Terrace Community Hospital by unknown persons. The baby, named Emily Wilson Collins, has a distinctive small birthmark on her right ankle. Margaret stared at her right ankle. She had always had a small brown birthmark there. As a child, Eleanor had called it a natural blemish and told her to hide it whenever possible. Feeling dizzy, Margaret printed out the article. She hurriedly put on her coat and grabbed her bag. The old records room at Chicago Police Headquarters smelled of dust and aged paper. Margaret filled out a public records request form and waited. She was fortunate. The archivist in charge, Robert Johnson, was kind and helpful. The Collins kidnapping case from 1986, he raised an eyebrow. One of our unsolved cases. Why are you looking into it? It's part of a genealogy project, Margaret lied. My cousin was born on the same day, so. Robert may not have believed her, but he brought an old file box without comment. Only publicly available records, he explained. Some investigation records are still confidential. Margaret opened the file and froze. There was a baby photo. And she recognized that face. It was the same face she had thought was her own baby picture. Next to it was a photo of a grieving young couple. The woman's greenish eyes were the same color as Margaret's. The man's high cheekbones matched Margaret's. Her hand trembled. Were these her real parents? She examined the records further, reading the investigation details and testimonies. Then she found another crucial piece of information. Multiple suspects had been investigated at the time of the kidnapping, but without conclusive evidence, the case remained unsolved. On the suspect list were Richard and Eleanor Collins, who lived in the North Terrace district at the time. This is no coincidence, Margaret whispered in a trembling voice. With permission, she copied parts of the records and headed to her next destination. Margaret's sedan stopped in front of the house where she had grown up. She took a deep breath, clutching the folder containing the evidence she had gathered. Today, she intended to learn the truth. Eleanor opened the door. Margaret, she said with surprise. What are you doing here? Richard said. We need to talk, Margaret said quietly but firmly. I want Richard to join us too. In the living room, Margaret sat across from her parents. She took out the DNA test results. Please explain this, she said. Why do I have no blood relation to you? The color drained from Eleanor's face. Richard cleared his throat but couldn't speak. And this too, Margaret spread out the newspaper article and copied police records. Emily Wilson Collins. A baby kidnapped on March 15, 1986. My birthday. A baby with the same birthmark on her right ankle as mine. This must be some mistake, Richard said in a low voice. But his eyes reflected fear. It's not a mistake, Margaret replied quietly. You kidnapped me, didn't you? And forged my birth certificate. Why? After a long silence, Eleanor began to cry. Richard, we can't hide it anymore. Richard sighed deeply. We wanted a child, he began. After years of fertility treatments with no success. Then we saw you at a shopping mall. No one was watching. It was impulsive. You were so adorable, Eleanor continued tearfully. We thought we could be good parents. Give you a wonderful life. But then Vanessa was born, Margaret said. You unexpectedly had your own child. Richard nodded in silence. And your affection for me faded, Margaret's voice was calm, but her eyes were filled with sadness. Once you had your own real child, you didn't need me anymore. That's not true, Eleanor said weakly. But her eyes were fixed on the floor. Margaret stood up. I'm going to report this to the police. And find my real family. Wait. Richard jumped up anxiously. Isn't there something we can do? Margaret turned back and looked at the people who had raised her, and who had stolen her true identity. Tell the truth. As spring's sunlight gently enveloped the quiet suburban neighborhood of Chicago, Margaret, now Emily Wilson Collins, reclaiming her real name, nervously stepped out of her car. She paused in front of the red brick house and took a deep breath. 6 months had passed since the case came to light. Richard and Eleanor had been arrested for kidnapping and identity forgery, and were currently on trial. Shockingly, Vanessa was also under investigation as an accomplice for knowing and concealing the situation. But today, Emily's mind was filled not with those matters, but with the people she was about to meet, her real parents who had been searching for her for 39 years. The door opened, and an elderly man and woman appeared. Tears glistened in James and Catherine's eyes. Emily, Catherine said in a trembling voice. It really is you. There was a moment beyond words. Then the three shared a long embrace, filled with 39 years of loss and love. In the living room, Emily's brother and sister were waiting. Matthew and Sarah had been 3 and 2 years old, respectively, when their sister was kidnapped. They warmly welcomed the sister they had only known from photographs. "We talked about you every day," Catherine said, holding her daughter's hand. "Every birthday, we made a cake. Because we believed you would return someday." Tears welled in James's eyes. "We never gave up searching. Even after the police scaled back their investigation, we continued hiring private detectives. But there were no leads." The family opened photo albums, showing Emily pieces of her own life she had never known, photos taken right after her birth, the room prepared for her, and toys that had been carefully preserved even after she disappeared. "For 39 years, we kept praying," Catherine said. "That you were safe and loved." Emily smiled bitterly. "I was safe, but as for being loved..." She told them about her life, growing up in a cold environment, always feeling different. The rejection after Vanessa was born. And how a DNA test had changed her life. "The pieces of the puzzle of my life finally fit together," Emily said. "There was a reason for the lack of belonging I felt for years." During the trial, more shocking facts came to light. Richard and Eleanor had used Margaret as a source of income. Much of her salary was collected under the name of family expenses, but was actually used for Vanessa's education and living costs. Moreover, they had deliberately treated Margaret in ways that lowered her self-esteem, manipulating her to remain financially and emotionally dependent. "But that's over now," Emily smiled at her family. "I'm starting a new life." She had taken a new position at work, begun using her real name, and most importantly, established an organization to support families searching for missing children. "I hope my experience can help others," Emily explained. "Everyone has the right to know the truth." At dusk, they held a small barbecue party in the Wilson family's backyard. Emily talked and laughed with her newly found siblings, trying to make up for 39 years of lost time. She raised her glass and proposed a toast. "Love and respect, not blood ties, make a real family," she said. "I've learned that from both sides."